Hello everyone, today we're going to do some ink studies of different textures for animals. So to start out with, I'm going to show off, I have two different types of pens I use. So there's the Sharpie marker, which you guys have. If you want to, you can invest in a nicer micron pen with a thinner tip to it. I'm going to do the whole demo with the Sharpie since we all have that though. So I'm going to start by labeling things, and then just like before, I always want to sketch. So I will be using a pencil, and I'll also be grabbing an eraser to get rid of my graphite after. So like last time, we want to start out with an actual animal to base this off of. So I found like a picture of a dog, and I'm making sure to sketch in those features. And when I do this, I'm also sketching the direction that my fur is going to go in. So you can see that. And I'm not drawing every hair. I'm keeping some space apart. I'm showing myself where these angles and what the lengths of the different hairs are going to be so that I can use that to guide how I'll draw with my actual pen. Again, to start out with, I'm going to grab my Sharpie and kind of outline any areas where I know for sure this is going to be a smooth area. So the eye is very grounding for me, and that's an easy part for me to shade and not have to deal with too much texture yet. So I'll start there. Wherever I want it to be darker, I'll go over a couple of times. I tend to favor using a cross-hatching or a hatching technique. I think it's really fast. If you would like to use stippling instead, then you're absolutely welcome to use that instead. So there's like the base of my eyes. I'm going to go around it wherever I see it's dark. I always have a photo near me for when I'm doing these things so that I'm looking at my reference the whole time. Then I'm going to start and go in with the fur. Again, I want to pay attention to the direction it's going in, and for this I hold my Sharpie at sort of an angle so that I don't get the very thickest part of it. So I'll follow the motions of the curves that I'll see in those different hairs. Some of them are going to be very short and some of them are going to be very long. Wherever I want it to be darker, I'm going to layer. So you see me going under the eye, it's very dark. So I have these kind of short, darker hairs, and I'll layer those together until I get the right value for this. Now I'm just going to keep going real quick, get all the different values that I want to. I don't scribble any hairs like all together, but each one is individual. So again, I angle my pen so that it's not the very blunt part of it that's making the strokes, but really the side of it, and so you can still get these kind of thin marks. Now when you want things to look like they're a little bit lighter, notice that I keep them further from each other, and a lot of the strokes I'm making are very quick, so that my pen doesn't bleed quite as much and I don't get so thick of a line. So the lines look smooth and they look thin because of the actions that I'm taking and the way that I'm moving it around. So I'm just going to finish this off, add any extra layers and hairs all over the place, and that's it for this particular study. So next I'm working on the wings of a swan, and that's where I'm getting my feathers from. So I'm going to start by sketching it. And I chose a swan specifically because a lot of us have animals that are very light, and we want to look at what you have to do when you want an animal to still look light, white, but to do it in ink, which is very dark and kind of harder to control. So with my feathers, just like when we did the graphite study, you want to pay attention to the direction, size, and curve of all of the feathers kind of more individually. So there are definitely parts, like big areas that I can sketch out, but then I'll draw the individual little wing and feather parts inside of them. So here's like my basic sketch for that. This one has a lot of details so that I can really add a lot to this. Now, as I'm outlining, I'm trying to be very quick about my lines and keep them a little bit more broken so it looks like light is getting through there. That's going to keep this looking very delicate, like it's still white. And I like to use the edge of my marker, not the very tip of it, not the blunt end. If you get really close, you can see that my lines are broken. So they're kind of fading, they're very quick, and they don't fully attach. Again, that's going to help give the illusion that light is getting through, and these outlines aren't very heavy because the color of these wings for the swan aren't very heavy. I'll also add shadows to help pop out those brighter different values that I want. So I want you to notice that with your Sharpie marker, you can make thin lines if you use the edge of it, and you can make some thicker lines if you use the actual blunt part of it. So hold it and experiment with those different ways when you're making this. I tend to do some of my more confident lines with the blunt part, so they look a little bit thicker. And then my shadows, since this is still going to be a very light animal and I don't want my shadows to look black, I use that thin edge of the Sharpie and do it very quickly. So experiment with how to hold it the best so that you get those different types of lines. So I'm going to keep adding those shadows. They'll act like midtones, they'll act like the cast shadows that the different individual wings have, but look for those areas where instead of white or like the base color, it looks extra dark, and you'll add some shadow to that, and that will make those individual strands stand out more when you have that kind of contrast. So my last animal I'm going to sketch out is a betta fish. So I have a nice picture where I can see the texture. I'm going to draw a good amount of it, but I'm probably not going to actually texture all of it with the ink. So I'm going to go in here with my graphite pencil, get in the fins, and then to actually do the scales texture, I treat this similar to how we did cross contour lines. So if you look at this fish, it's curving and it's like a tube that curves. So I'm going to indicate those lines, and those will give me some direction for when I'm doing the scales as to how I want those scales to also move. I don't want this to look like one texture that has no movement to it, but it will shift along with the body of the animal. So just testing out my Sharpie marker here. What I really want to do is I want to get in those scales. So I'm kind of separating the body with the scales from the fin part, but then I'm going to go in here and go over my lines again and start to add the texture. Now, scales, like we said before, individual, and especially on fish, they have a pattern to them. So when you study it, look for the shape of them, and you have to layer those together. Not just pure loops, but actually look at which way they curved, if they have angles, and try to get that sense of pattern. So I'm going along the body here and noticing where my lines get smaller, the scales are getting smaller. Notice where they're curving up towards the top, the angle shift. And then once I have a good amount of that, I can go in with my Sharpie and start to individualize and split apart the different aspects of this animal. So the fins that are up at the top are really smooth, and so I'll start with those because it's easy to look at those. Next, I'm going to start going in and differentiating the scales. So again, you have to treat them very individually. So lightly with the edge of my Sharpie, I'm going to go over the ones that I did in graphite. And if you want to add your shadows in with a stippling technique, I like to start out with that. But I do want to draw the scales and then shade them. Treat each one like it has its own little cast shadow underneath it. So you see me adding those shadows as I'm building that texture. I'm going to go around to those fins that are surrounding it, kind of contrast, add any patterns I see, smooth out any outlines for that. And then after I have a good amount of that done, I can like return back into the scales texture. So it's kind of a back and forth process. So here I am doing that. Then there's the fins that are on the bottom. We really want to give this the most context that we can. So surround the scales by other things, again, so that they stand out. I'm going to go add some more at the top. When I look at my picture, I can see that the top of this fish, or the right side of it, is very dark. So I'm going to go over and add that sense of shadow, basically completely covering those scales with their own dark value on them. I leave a little bit of the edge just to indicate a highlight. It's not completely dark. I can still see the individual quality of each scale. But Notice how the light hits all of them. So some of them are going to be in shadows, so I'm going to add this hatching texture where I see those shadows, and then I'll leave some of them alone so that they can still look very light and bright like a highlight is hitting them. Now when you're done with all of them, you're going to take your eraser and clean them up so there's no graphite left, and you'll have just a nice picture completely done for you. If you see anything kind of disappears once your graphite is gone, you can add in a little bit more, but that's all that really needs to be done.